The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried in a stack of junk mail and bills, its cream envelope yellowed at the edges and addressed in a shaky, precise hand that the clerk in the records office did not recognize until she saw the return name and felt the blood drain from her face. She had typed that name countless times in old reports and seen it whispered across faded case files. A name that belonged to the ghost of a man the city hoped was dead. The suspected serial killer tied to a string of bodies no one had ever officially closed. Instead of sending it through the usual channels, she carried it herself to the cold case unit and laid it on the desk like a small bomb from another era. And the room went silent as every detective there realized exactly which nightmares might be waking up. When the lead detective finally slit the envelope open, the air seemed to thicken, as if the building itself was bracing to hear what a man who had vanished decades ago might say with whatever breath he had left. The letter smelled of old paper and dust, written in careful blue ink on textured stationery, the handwriting disciplined and almost elegant, each loop and line too controlled for someone claiming to be frail. He did not open with apology or drama, but by calmly correcting the record, listing small details from the murders that had never been released. The color of a ribbon in one victim's hair, the way a shoe had landed meters from a body, a smear of blood shaped like a crescent on a concrete floor. A junior detective scrolled through digitized photos and nodded with each match, realizing with a chill that whoever wrote this either stood over those bodies or had access to a memory no outsider could fake. He called himself an old man with nothing left to bargain, writing from a prison hospital 3 states away, and the name on the return address matched the suspect who had once slipped through their fingers and then disappeared into rumor. What unsettled them most was how easily he drifted between his failing lungs, the nurses who wheeled him to a thin rectangle of window each morning, and cool descriptions of women who never saw another sunrise because of him. The confession moved like a ledger rather than a boast, each victim introduced with a year and a place, followed by a plain sequence of actions that felt all the more brutal for their lack of flourish. He described waiting by a riverbank with a practiced smile, the joke he used to lower one girl's guard, the moment she realized the car door would not open from the inside, and the song on the radio she tried to keep singing even as her voice shook. Another paragraph reproduced a victim's final plea in quotation marks, but he did not explain why that line had stayed with him. He simply moved on, one life to the next, the way the original police reports had cataloged scenes they never fully understood. Between these accounts, he wove fragments of his ordinary life. A factory job that stained his hands, a sister who stopped calling, Sundays spent in the back pew watching families he never joined, as if stitching together a narrative where he was both monster and sad old man. The detectives recognized the manipulation in that balance, but they still circled certain sentences, especially mentions of side roads, bridges, and billboards, because those were concrete bones they could test against the map. Then the killings in his story stopped, and years were compressed into a few lines about drifting through television news segments on other murderers, feeling simultaneously overlooked and relieved. He claimed there was one night when he drove back to an old dumping ground, intending to repeat the ritual, only to find it transformed into a children's playground. Neon slides planted where he once left bodies under trees. That, he wrote, was when he understood he had grown old, that the city had moved on without him, and the urges that once pulled him like a tide had faded into background noise. The detectives argued quietly over whether that was truth or self-mythology, a man trying to paint himself as someone who chose to stop rather than someone who simply ran out of strength or opportunity, but they marked the location anyway and added it to a growing list of places to search. Near the end, he addressed the police directly, recalling the night they almost caught him, the sound of their boots on the wrong stairwell while he hid 3 floors below, pressed against a rattling washing machine that shook like a terrified heart. In the closing pages, the tone shifted from ledger to something closer to performance, as if he knew these lines would outlive him. He confirmed 2 suspected victims the department had never officially tied to the case, describing discarded jewelry and a shallow grave near a rusted falling rock sign on an old service road, detailed enough that the detectives could already see where to send search teams. Then, with deliberate cruelty, he hinted at others he would not name, insisting they were beyond reach now, a phrase that might mean destroyed evidence, misfiled remains, or another small power play from a man with very little left to control. The letter ended not with a legal confession, but with an image. At night, he said, he sometimes saw his victims' faces reflected in the blank television across from his bed, not as he left them, but as they might have looked if they had been allowed to grow old. Whether that was genuine remorse or another manipulation, the detectives could not agree, but they knew those lines would be repeated in news segments and documentaries for years, turning his final act into another story people would pick apart. In the weeks that followed, searches at the locations he named turned up remains in one overgrown clearing and nothing at others, leaving families with answers and new questions in equal measure. And by the time word arrived that he had died alone in his hospital cell, the letter had already become another kind of crime scene. Copied, analyzed, and archived in a box that would wait patiently in the records room for the next pair of hands to open it and feel the past reach out through ink and paper.